Hello everyone, today we talk about the Tudor military and especially the lords, lieutenants and the militia system. We This is my first video on the organization of the English military in any age, and I think this is a very fascinating chapter. I like the Tudor era in many ways, especially the Elizabethan period, and I wanted to focus more on on this topic, and especially on the train bands and how England coped with the military situation internally to the British Islands and abroad by trying, as many other states were doing at that time, to establish a sort of permanent military that would take place definitely and successfully only after the Commonwealth and eventually with the end of the Restoration. I would like to give also a bit of a bit of background to essentially describe what we're talking about. So 16th century England, so a relatively small scale of warfare that however was not indifferent, mainly against France. Then especially troubles with Scotland, Ireland, and an intervention to the Netherlands, often in alliance with the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs, against France, and also helping in part the French Protestants during the wars of religion in there. And at this point, however, this warfare, though not extremely intense, however, showed England that their kingdom was relatively lagging behind other nations at the time, especially in terms of centralization and also in sheer amount of resources. I mean, England at this time didn't have for instance, a very great cavalry or a very great artillery. They had to import these resources from abroad, from more developed regions, mostly the Netherlands, and they would have also to adopt the Pike&Shot system during this very age at a satisfactory level. The only problem being that they didn't practically have a permanent standing army, and the whole thing went basically on with a national militia system from one side, and generally the hiring of mercenaries. That was, telling the truth, the standards also in other in the average of the rest of Europe at that time. However, it should be noted that England was a kingdom of ancient military organization. Since the Anglo-Saxon times, you can argue that, especially previously to the Norman conquest, the Kingdom of England had matured pretty very advanced and solid recruitment system that would be inherited partly by the Normans in parallel with feudalism, and that would have been eventually surpassed by by a sort of reformation. We can call it this way, or reform better, that takes the name after the Assize of Arms of 1181. That in practice, among other things, and the general political meaning that can be scoped in it, that is still foggy, however. It basically was established how how the English people essentially had to be equipped, armed, excuse me, for warfare and participating to the military business, and there would be even pretty pretty detailed dispositions relatively to, obviously, it was something mostly based on census, on how much wealth you had in order to um, contribute through that to the well-being, to the defense, especially of the realm. You know that England eventually, especially after the defeat of Bouvines, grew this increasingly um, self-conserve, social conservative way of dealing with political and military affairs, especially the ones coming for the crown, for which there would be certain rights that the communities have had, and that couldn't be touched essentially without the dispensation of the same communities. Then things were obviously a bit more complicated. But what interests us at this point is that in practice, during the 16th century, this system, albeit with some modifications, was still in use. Um, and at a certain point, you can argue that the whole freeman class could be mustered for military duty in some fashion. That was something very, something ancient. It stems from the ancient ban of the Germanic peoples, for which every able freeman was theoretically eligible to military service. But at this point in history, things were a bit more complicated than in the early Middle Ages. And the greatest problem at this point was even finding the money to raise these peoples. And the military administration was mostly based on the county basis. There would be and run by the so-called commissioners of musters, that would be replaced exactly through this time and mid of the 16th century with the lords lieutenants that we will talk about in a while. And there would be some contributions that also the clergy, especially monetary terms, think about here that England has a self-standing church at this point, so the king basically controlled it directly and could ask for, without asking for to the Pope, and also and especially to the old feudal class that was the one of the lords and therefore their retainers. The aristocracy, the nobility that had substantial patrimony that could be and had to be put, although in the English case, as I was saying, was a bit, depending from from which side you were thinking it, because from the king's side it was one thing, from the lords another one. And it would be similar obligations that were, however, administered separately from the national levy. And obviously, the national levy at this point in England was still a relatively small country, but it could, in theory, count a total of 1 million men eligible for service. And obviously this is a ridiculous thing, because nobody at this time could ever even dream to raise such a number of troops, because you have the men, they are eligible by right, but if you don't equip them, if you don't supply them, you can't do nothing with them. So this was the situation. So today we will see how the national militia system was eventually transformed, actually quite late in time. We are already in the Elizabethan era, in 1573, into the it wasn't really transformed, but it was added to it the so-called trained bands that were kind of more restricted corps that could be used, but we'll be seeing it in a while. And you have to think that England at this time was also, as I was saying before, a bit backwards in terms of tactics and generally warfare, especially in land matters, terrestrial matters, because we are in the Renaissance period. So at this time, the most advanced countries would be Spain, the Netherlands, France in its own way, of course, too. The Italians were declining, the Germans were trying to do something better. But however, the dominating tactics were the so-called pike and shot ones that required, for their very nature, a very very considerable amount of resources. First of all, in terms of time, at least, to keep with pikes and firearms, arquebuses, muskets, already at the end of the period, considered now, and these would be extremely expensive weapons that required an even greater expense for training soldiers through it, because they required a level of collective training which implied lots of guys essentially working all together, and you had to feed them and you had to practice over and over and over again. And this expanded the costs enormously. Think about also the gunpowder that has always been, even before the weapons and the projectiles, the most expensive thing, and had necessarily a form of broader organization that had to be organized. England was very slowly centralizing its administrative system, but it simply didn't have those resources yet to create a full pike and shot army. And there would be Englishmen at this point, we will be seeing it, still fighting with bills, longbows, and other, you can argue, obsolete weapons. Maybe at the beginning of the 15th century that wasn't the case, but definitely in the second half things were running fast towards firearms and pikes. And that wouldn't be enough. And by the way, as I was saying, it wasn't just a matter of actual effectiveness, because in order to be a longbowman, you require a freaking lot of training, but it's an individual training, and the overall effectiveness that you can reach with pike and shot tactics with a good trained group of soldiers definitely surpasses any longbow. And there are still crossbows at these times being used, but it was, evident that that was fading away. Just to look a bit beyond, the militia system actually was maintained in the 17th century. Charles I, ironically, wasn't that bad sovereign that, you know, who knows English history, was saying, all it started because of him. Well, yes, in part, of course, but he wasn't a bad king. And he actually reformed militia, and paradoxically, during the Civil War, that was a weapon that was used against him. And however, the time of the militias were over, and England would have progressively evolved towards, the British Redcoats to to what we iconically remember as them, the professional army that from the end of the 17th and especially the beginning of the 18th century grew exponentially along with the centralization of the English of the United Kingdom at this point, and that definitely, used militia just in contests of, local defense, or even joining campaigns. But these weren't so reliable guys. I think also in the colonies, it was obviously important to have a self-defense in the local communities, and that's something that remains still, in the British as well as American tradition. The idea that it's theoretically citizens that have to bear arms, while in the rest of Europe, the one especially influenced by the Napoleonic gendarmerie, like in France, where it still exists, or in Italy with the carabinieri, that's theoretical. It's just a state that can be armed, and masses are preferably very lightly armed, if not even. But this is another story. So just to enter into the matter, let's talk a bit about these lords lieutenants that are very interesting figure because they basically worked as the royal longamanus, we can say, to intervene more directly into the military administration of the counties. They essentially replaced the old sheriff's military authority in here. If I'm not wrong, they were firstly appointed like in the 40s of the 16th century under Henry VIII still, and they had essentially to look after the efficiency of the local militia of the counties, and also of the yeomanry and volunteers that were still there technically in the English system. And this was a sort of well, yeah, I could say other things, but let's stick to here to the fact that relatively to the lords lieutenants, they were sort of appointees. I mean, they weren't really a structural presence into the local administration in the sense that the lords would only have a temporary duty in there, and they could be sent as long as the king wanted to control better or or wars a certain place. Very famous also later, especially in the 17th century, but also in Elizabethan times and before. There was famously the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland that was one of the most important, also because Ireland was basically this 1/4 around Dublin that was an English presence, the rest being a bit more troublesome because it wasn't practically under the full control of the crown, although formally Ireland was subjected. And the lieutenancies began in this sense to evolve also towards something more organized. They would be recognized officially by the English Parliament in 1550, and they had a very particular role, especially during later times when the Spanish were about to land at any moment on the British soil, and these officers ensured a very important control on the local militias and military organization as they were they were being formed at that point. The office of lieutenancy was eventually abolished by the Commonwealth, that had a wholly different idea of power and military organization, and it would come again into during the Restoration. And in this sense, the moment that saw really the greater acceleration in the organization of the lieutenancy was, as we were saying, the moments of looming Spanish threat. And that were incidentally the ones also in which the militias were being developed accordingly to meet the same threat. Between 1585 and 87, the military resources of the counties were placed under the control of a Lord Lieutenant, sorry. Eventually this would change, we will see it, but at that moment it was necessary to have a direct control through the crown on this matters. And These are very important because the lieutenants were actually Privy Council's members, so they weren't, as you have understood, quite normal statal officers. They were quite important and influent politicians that had their own um, their own interests, even their own way of abusing of these new power. And they would be in direct contact with royal power, and the same royal power could use them as political pawns, at least if it was possible. We will see that Elizabeth at one point reduced the size of these the number of these officers, because she wanted to basically avoid decentralization and to favor especially her favorite, the Essex, who was Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, by the way. And the What else can we say about this is that um, the the importance of the Lords Lieutenants was also that they usually knew the local gentry. And they knew at this point, the local gentry had always had an important role in the administration of the militia, because they were the top guys in society there, being the wealthiest ones. And they had those, they were actually entrusted in of the command of the militia in parts, and through their own same riches, in the sense that this was pretty much the standard. In England it was a bit different, but generally speaking, at this point, the best thing the states could do, since they didn't have still the authority and the means to rise power, was to appoint certain people, depending from where you were in Europe. Here there were the English gentlemen, then you can find nobles of other kind in Europe, etc. To rise the militia and to supply it, to keep it. And obviously these guys would kind of wanted to have an economical gain from this. So there was a lot of corruption, there were a lot of kind of mob ties among these communities. They weren't absolutely very good times. Society was violent, poor, primitive, criminal in many ways. And the Lord Lieutenants really played on the gentry, because they knew usually, which button they could push, where they could find money, etc. So there would be a direct tie between between these figures. And what is interesting in this sense is that let's see, what happens is that by the end of the 16th century, most countess did when the Spanish threat was over, and Elizabeth wanted to reabsorb all the possible competitors that existed um, in the administration. Many countess basically never saw another appointment of Lord Lieutenants, and these were substituted by so-called Master Commissioners that were, however, very different persons, because they were from lower social classes, generally speaking, and therefore they didn't have the same political weight of the lords. And as we were saying before, Elizabeth did this mostly to favor the Essex because he was at that point could be more powerful in the management of political and military affairs. And another reason why she did that is because she wanted to try a further step towards centralization in many ways, because taking away the Lord Lieutenants meant that now the local military communities, the militia, was in direct contact with the Privy Council, which um, corresponded in turn to a obviously to a more brutal I give an order and you follow that essentially without having an intermediate figure that knew better. So there would be local English communities that were actually eager to participate to the militia because they saw that as a sort of national duty, was a way to defend their own families in many ways. It had a mostly defensive purpose, and at that point they were starting being asked more, and they kind of protested in some way. And this, in spite of the fact that obviously it created problems, it shows that the dialectics between the crown and and therefore the central government and the local authorities basically worked, because there was the idea that theoretically that service was needed, and the crown wanted to get directly in managing that, and there was no incommunicability. Militiamen wanted to do their duty, and yet they wanted a bit more of respect, we can say, a bit more of attention to their needs. So, however, let's pass to the militia at this point, because I think it's the most important thing, and it's also fascinating to reason about it. In many ways, in the political, social, and not just military implications that it entailed. So, as we were saying, England needed troops to, if anything, to get, to keep the pace with the increasing tumultuous rhythms of European warfare, and she had obviously a need to intervene here and there with good soldiers, essentially. And it would be evident at a point during the 16th century that having all this militia, and in theoretical numbers, or even of 1 million, we have seen that Henry VIII once fielded for 1 month theoretically 120,000 troops, but it's not that he actually fielded them, he just put them into mobilization, I know we said it in English. um, and the best solution, which is obvious, and I'd say, and it was something that was done elsewhere in every time in history, was to essentially say, okay, everyone, every free male, able male, is has to bear arms theoretically for the defense of the kingdom, of the crown, and but at that point it was much more effective to provide actually to make only a few people from the community participating to military affairs, and to make the rest of the community providing for their own equipment and training, so that you wouldn't have a whole mass of of inepts who don't even have arms, because they couldn't have them, but they could field, a decent level militia that could intervene also in, as we will be seeing now, in other, even outside England in exceptional cases, that was decently equipped and trained, etc. And this is how the so-called trained bands were created. So you have to imagine into these English or early modern communities, largely peasant, country areas, etc. The families, the communities, the local gentlemen choosing, appointing, essentially the best potential soldiers, and leaving the rest of the juridical, let's say at this point, militia, because de facto they didn't carry arms anymore, to train the men, and to supply them, to equip them, etc. And or in case of terrible emergency, to act as to work in a logistical sense. I mean, as pioneers, as non-armed personnel that, however, was meant to favor the military movements, etc. And there was a first ride that was famously the train bands of London will remain famous because the quality of these bands would obviously reflect the kind of communities from which people came from. London was arguably the only city in England in practice, if we want to be very harsh in judgment, and it would be increasingly more. I mean, London is England and England is London. Point. It was the largest city, the most populated, the richest one, and therefore also the Londoners could be better equipped in this sense. And they made a show in 1572 with 3,000 military personnel of militia, equipped with Pike&Shot, so in the best fashion that you up-to-dated equipment you could find at that point. And they displayed these kind of war games on for the Queen Elizabeth on occasion of May Day. And therefore, at that point, it was decided by the Crown that, okay, let's make these train bands start as kind of nationwide form of military organization, and this followed the year later, 73. However, the main problem, as obviously this triggered a lot of, this is typical of modern history, the new organization triggered necessarily new expenses that would be obviously paid, because this was the sense, by the local communities, so not by the state, very cleverly. Yet the state had to provide also in some fashion to organize them, to keep them, in the sense that the local communities didn't have really muskets under their beds. I mean, still the country had theoretically to make weapons coming very often outside of the same British islands, the necessary weapon and all. Think about all the papers, all the military administration, so a lot of bureaucracy and expenses that were, however, paid by the Crown. And the major problem would be immediately the costs. As always, war is a matter of costs. Always, and in any case and in any circumstance, war is just about money. Not just because you fight to be richer, or to live better, more poetically, but also because you can't make war without actual material material. I mean, you can have the most heroic people in the world, but if you don't equip them or train them, they're gonna get slaughtered just as every other single person on this world. Just for saying also that military matters are something that get far beyond the national character of peoples. Although I must say that exactly in the English case, there's always been a kind of spirit, kind of community organization, which, as we were saying, it was something very old, and that you could even see during I don't know, the Battle of England, that it wasn't just about the military, it was just about the whole community that worked as one, organizedly, orderly, and this was quite important in military affairs, and it was important at that point, also in the 16th century. So that initially the trained bands would make up 1/10 of the numbers of the men eligible for militia. But there would be problems also in international trade and so on. So even 1/10 of the soldiers couldn't be equipped at that point. There weren't the actual goods for the gear. So that there would be variation, like there would be certain areas that could field could field more troops, because this wasn't uniform, as we were saying. It was all based on the actual local communities, so that was absolutely relative. There was no, still at least at this stage, no uniformation of the whole system. And there would be also the problem of training them and paying for armor. A very few of these people, by the way, could even afford actually the thing for themselves, because for us maybe it's a bit strange, but still at those times theoretically men were expected at least to equip themselves in some way, and the state increasingly intervened because they couldn't, and this was the main problem. But there would be people who could bring their own, purchase their own gear in some cases, and you have to think about all the costs. I mean, just the training. Think about the powder and match and shot spent during the training itself. I mean, it's something that that costs. I mean, that was a very it was still a very primitive world in many ways. Wealth wasn't created with a snap, nor it is today. But in those times, the it was also still everything was based in pre-industrial societies on crop rates, and the growth was the normal economic growth would be quite small, aside from maybe certain important financial centers, like London was, incidentally, and that was why I was saying that the Londoners similarly had the best trained bands. So yeah, and um, yeah, there could be other. I'm just thinking about here. I have some notes. Um, yeah, there would be also other problems relatively to the organization of the same. The idea that, for instance, because England at this point it was believed that it could see an invasion from a moment to another, rightfully. And one problem was also, if we go to war as trained bands, who's gonna defend our communities? Like, if the Spanish invade, who thinks to my wife, to my children? That's quite of a problem. So there would be many adjustments also into the local communities that, however, reacted seemingly with some efficiency. Um, and the Another point was also the kind of equipment. We were saying that ideally speaking, this militia that was of the train bands had to be equipped like pike and shot infantry. At this time, in the rest of Europe, there would be militias equipped in that fashion, but the point is that there was a shortage of weapons. And as we said before, certain militiamen and trained bands went into service with bows and bills. There would be quite of a shortage, especially of firearms. And there will be also all the many costs attached to that, but just for saying that, for instance, in 1584, the council required the same council required the bands of Devon to provide this number of soldiers, 1,200 shooters, so equipped with firearms, 800 archers, and 1,000 pikemen. We are in the very late 16th century. The English still went of war with bows. And I'll tell you what, in Henry VIII times, there would have not really been much to laugh about, because longbows were something effective still at that time. But in Elizabethan times, this we're starting to wait, because technology was speeding fast, and although that wasn't really the really determining factor, as in any war, telling the truth, it would have seen still been better to provide um, uh, to provide other better weapons. Here, Hampshire was to provide 800 shooters, 200 archers, and 500 pikemen. So these were the numbers. And the same council basically was asking that, and that tells you, the resignation in some fashion of the same state to say, okay, let's go to war also with bows and bills, but if it's better than nothing. Yeah. Um, 16th century warfare this time was telling the truth also quite still pretty much melee, um, melee, or how you want to call it. So maybe bills weren't that bad after all. And one of the other consequences that would be obvious at that point, given to the non-uniform system here, is that there would be counties that produced quite good trained troops. Take the 3000 of London, and others that instead were, gave a very poor contribute, because they could just make a very sort of kind of very patchy um, military base of troops that could maybe just be attached to the uh, to 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 the others, rather than really being able to stand the ground by themselves for the military standards of those times. So I think, however, there is one point that I was hinting to before, relatively to the to the English community as such. I mean, their identity, their attachment to the crown, etc. Is that the trained bands were still meant to be a defense force. I mean, to be an autonomous force um, of Englishmen, meant to defend their home. So this was very important. Queen Elizabeth the first in this was. She wanted to appear like the mother of all the English. This idea that she stressed strongly, even to ask for military contribution, the idea that the English at that point were under attack. So the whole thing was really aimed at conceiving England as of these military demands, in a way that she had to defend herself. So it wasn't something that the crown was asking for, waging war who knows where, making pay the English community for nothing from the perspective of the guys. Um, but it was something really for the good of England, for the good of home, of the dear old England, and in a way that, in that sense, was conceived as a great common effort to defend the motherland, and to ensure a future to itself. Indeed, England went close to being conquered by the Spanish. Once if the Spanish had landed in England, definitely the English kingdom would have been conquered and kept. Point. So at this point, we're not talking about the English fleet that did most of the job in this sense, but also, like in other times in history, as I was saying, this kind of English spirit, the idea that, yeah, let's stick together. Essentially, let's show them that we can do something as one people, to defend ourselves, to say this is England and nobody can really kid with us, was reflected on the rather generous contribution that local communities did in order to defend themselves. And this would be exploited, obviously, politically speaking, from the crown to push for more demands in military terms. Yet there was an inherent fault into this. I mean, we're still talking about militia. We're not talking about an effective army at all. The same kind of Elizabethan war making was, however, sensibly um, marked by these problems, because from one side was the obvious and major problem of uh, ship maintainment. The idea that new warships were needed to shield off the Spanish fleet in the Channel or around the British Islands. That was a very considerable effort, and the English made a hell of a job there as well, even though they were quite lucky. Also in the whole strategic outcome of the story. But indeed, there was also the problem that theoretically the military and the, let's say, the Royal Navy in this sense intervened a bit everywhere. There is a lot of warfare here. If you think about the Battle of Gravelines, as you want to call it, in 1558, if I'm not wrong, or where the English ships basically made the day one against the French by shooting on the French army from naval artillery and so on. So there would be a lot of English naval intervention around, especially obviously the North Sea, the Channel, etc. But there would be also the eventuality of sending English troops abroad, overseas, and who had to be sent. I mean, normally they were mercenaries, because we have seen that those were the only guys that basically could be sent there, because at this point the trained bands were still conceived as something that was territorial militia that had to remain in England. So to go overseas, either you had to be a volunteer, because this could happen as well, however, or a mercenary. So theoretically the militia didn't absolutely have, and that was its prerogative, to participate to external military affairs. However, there would be cases into which objectively the needs were such for which the English commander, English generals, and had to use trained bands also overseas. And we have obviously, yeah, there were militias, so we can't really make chapeau for them, but considering that still there were militia, they participated to a lot of warfare going around in very reduced numbers. Another thing that was to be done, especially during the crucial years of 87 or of 88, in which the Spanish Armada was wandering around the British Britain, and into which the trained bands would be used in a quite different fashion. As we said, the trained band was located into a county and operated in that county and was meant to defend that county. But the British bands at this point wouldn't be just used for local county defense, but it would basically be put together, joined into other, especially in certain coastal areas that were believed the Spanish could land in. So this would be a great coming together of many people from all over England to defend certain strategical areas that were there would have been crucial to control in case of Spanish invasion. And this implied a lot of things, because first of all, this required extra expenses. And at that time the English were freaking out, because really if the Spanish had invaded, there was just a very few they could do. So they could push even on fear, on the terror that was spreading, to force these guys to go elsewhere, to be maintained also by the same communities, because this was the actual thing. You know, the crown was asking the county to send his men in another place at their own expenses, and that was a hell of an expense because making a man marching and all the energies, the calories it requires, it's translated into a lot of money to be paid, and money, true money, not ideal money. And otherwise he can't eat, he can't fight nothing. And this, however, also triggered another element that happens, another factor that happens every time there is this sort of coming together, and the idea of, first of all, from the military, the guys, the commanders, the generals, to experiment, like forms of strategical mobility, new forms of organization, spotting new problems, answering to, because this system, when it was launched, it was quite primitive, but eventually, also thanks to the Lord's Lieutenants, it was something that was progressively refined and specialized, and also the local organization was locally pushing towards something strategically more relevant than just having a bunch of Pike&Shot guys in protecting a county. And in this way, also the English people coming from all over England, that they were English, but they wouldn't have much else in common at that point, would also kind of blend in. And also in terms of military quality, this was important because there would be certain troops who were more skilled, better trained, and it was believed that by mixing these guys in the organics would bring to a sort of fallout effect, for which the other guys would have kind of learned also better how to act. And every form of collective training and organization at that point is precious, because this gives you an experience that you can spend eventually in the actual need of warfare. Then, as we know, the Spanish invasion did not occur, but it was still important for the English crown to kind of taste the ground in some way, and to see what the collective capabilities of these troops could practically be. And there is also and relatively to this point, I wanted to add, in fact, that here I have some numbers, that in April 1588, so this is a crucial time, the trained bands of England and Wales numbered basically neither 50,000 foot and 5,000 cavalry. Because they were specialized, they weren't just, they wouldn't be just infantry, it would be every kind of specialization that could be use, also artificeries and etc. And this was actually quite a few. I mean, this is like the whole England and Wales combined, and this is just militia, by the way. So the Privy Council at that point asked to the counties to say, okay, send other untrained men in, and let's hope that by doing this they will learn from the other guys who are trained, from the trained bands. And in this sense, the trained infantry amounted to almost 90,000, sorry, and this also afforded multiple armies, because obviously they wouldn't be used in a single block, so to have a bit more of strategical flexibility to try to fill the gaps that could be created in case of an invasion or in any other practical situation. So the yeah, and there will be also a lot of sometimes no, I don't think I want to add very much. There could be also something here to say that it is yeah, I forgot this because this is important. The idea that, however, troops, because I started to talk about what happened when the trained bands could actually be used overseas. Well, in that case, it was a striking, you know, difference that at that point the crown had to pay these guys. I mean, already for making them move out of the county, there was a lot of debate, a lot of problem, because also those, as before I said that basically the county has still to pay largely for when its troops were sent in another place, even the same England, but sometimes, or most of the times, still English, I mean the crown's money would be needed. So Elizabeth used these this opportunity, this faculty, but she would do it just for very brief time, because paying for those for that mobilization would be really costly, and that also gives you in turn the sheer quantity of how few the crown could afford at that point, compared to the practical material expenses that instead the communities suffered elsewhere. And the, there would be at the very end of this period another thing that kind of still within the boundaries of this militia system was trying to force towards a more professional, at least a better quality service of these troops, because the Essex sought to reform once again his trained bands, and he basically made the trained bands theoretically were also relatively to the other militias some kind of elite for for the old militia standards. Well, the Essex chose 4,000 choice men, so-called, from all the trained bands. So basically, we said how many were they normally? 50,000. Well, he chose even less than 1/10. That would be elite at this point. Even for being militia, they would be some kind of militia elite. That is something that gets close to an actual professional army in some way. Which is also very important because strategically and logistically speaking especially, it's something very costly to move a lot of men. Especially if they're not good for much in practice. I mean, it's better to have a thin, agile corps of 4,000 men that even have some kind of good experience at that point in if anything, maybe not in direct combat more than much, but at least in knowing how to move in the camp, making things go without particular problems, and that have a certain good standard of discipline and cohesion. Even though cohesion at this point wouldn't be really the point, the thing, because they were chosen from other from different backgrounds, from different bands. And he would go with these guys into the Low Countries to war, next to the the veterans. I mean the professional guys that were fighting there, and they would serve decently well in offensive and defensive operation, and obviously not providing any decisive support, but still, and this is important. This was important for them, acquiring a certain type of experience that in England would have not really had, because aside from the wars with Scotland, etc., what was happening in the Netherlands back in the days was the most advanced warfare, the most brutal one that Europe probably had ever faced at some point, since some times at least. So I believe that this makes some good introduction to the lords, lieutenants, and the trained bands. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. I don't know, I'm not an expert on these topics, so I had to make a bit of research, but I don't know, I'm sure that there's plenty of people out there. I generally don't talk about British history, and mostly because sometimes my English is so bad that maybe a British audience would listen to me and say, "Oh, what the hell is he talking like?" You know. But also because obviously I expect British people to know British history better than me. At least I get I hope for them. But I know, unfortunately, considering the world's average um, historical awareness, probably most of the things I even said in this video here could be surprising for people who are closer to the events. But it's just my second video about British history, and I hope I liked it. At least today I like to tell the story differently from other times in which I do things running, and today I took a bit of time, but I think I got to what I wanted to say. So, if you enjoyed this video, please share it, otherwise leave a comment, or just subscribe to my channel if you want to receive further news about my contents, etc. And as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.